All right, so I'm going to talk about some common behaviour change mistakes. This is a presentation I've given a few times before, so I did have it as a backup. And I think I don't do this really in a way that's meant to be condescending. It's really in a way that is designed to just think about things through different lenses and try and address that problem that Jeremy talked about this morning, which is people thinking they know what the right solution is straight off the bat, but rather reflect a little bit. And so if we see, and you might even recognise yourselves, I certainly recognise myself in some of these mistakes. I often jump to them, particularly with my kids. I think this will work if I shout louder, that's going to change their behaviour. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So we all make them in life and indeed in public policy and practice as well. So I've got three, and the first one I think is one that we've talked about before, which is not fully understanding the problem. And as you saw in our method that we talked about earlier, and many of the presentations are referring to, the first step is really to unpack your problem, to think about your problem through different lenses, to use existing data to understand why behaviour may or may not occur. I think as a general comment, public bodies often hold lots of data that is underutilised. That's certainly been our experience, and we've been able to draw on that data to help shed light on understanding problems. And I'm going to start with an exercise, which is, in your mind, I want you to picture someone who has been reported to the Roads Authority, and we heard about this same intervention this morning, been reported just before from Nick and Praveen. Picture someone who's been reported for being an unsafe driver. Picture someone in your own mind's eye. Got a pretty good image? All right. Now, I want you to be honest. Hands up if your person looks something like this. Good? Okay, great. How many people thought someone like this? So those who took their hand up second are actually more right than the first. Because what tends to happen, and the evidence is really clear about this, is that women self-regulate their driving. So they know when they're bad drivers and they take themselves off the road. I sometimes think you need some kind of crowbar or other device to help wedge men out of the car as they enter older age. And the evidence is quite strong on that. And if you know that, then that automatically helps you understand the behaviour a little bit more. Maybe it's different interventions for men and women. You might be surprised to see, though, that the profile of people who are reported for being a dangerous driver looks something like this. These are the ages of people, and we start at 16 on the very left-hand side, and we go up to 96 on the right. You can see here that actually the median is somewhere in the 60s, which meaning half of the drivers are less than 66, I think. So actually there's an awful big cohort of drivers who are being reported for unsafe driving who are not what we picture in our own mind. They're actually a lot younger. I think what we actually want people to do, though, and like I say, we did hear about this from Nick and Praveen earlier, is once they are reported, we want them to go and fill out a form that says, they'll go to a doctor and get a medical certificate that says I'm fit or not fit to drive, and send that in to VicRoads. And so we use some of the data that VicRoads have to show that what we see is that there's some differences in age groups of people who do and don't submit their forms. So you can see that, yes, the over 70s are pretty good at not submitting their form. But some of the younger ages, and the next highest group is the 30 to 50-year-olds. So you may indeed think, okay, and even the quite young people under 30 are not submitting. And the 50 to 70s, I guess they're the ones who are desperate to hold their licence or not. You'd think they might be, but they're not submitting their paperwork. I think if you unpack that even further and say who's submitting on time and who's submitting late, you get to paint an even richer picture. So what we see is that they've got those same percentages of not submitting, but actually it's the group who are submitting late are the young people. It's the under 30s and the 30 to 50-year-olds. They're submitting it, but they're submitting it late. The point of me telling you this and showing you this is existing data. We can use this. And I think you're much better off designing interventions that can be a bit more nuanced and tailored if you know this sort of information. You might have a campaign specifically for the under 50s to make sure they submit their paperwork on time. I think another way that you might unpack problems in a better way is to use typologies. And typologies are a really useful tool that a lot of marketers use. It's kind of their bread and butter, and they've done it for a long time, to separate out. Now, this is some data on water use and attitudes and behaviours, knowledge, attitudes and behaviours about water. And it's based on a sample of over 5,000 people right around the country. And what we see is when we do some analysis that there are some really good people and some really bad people in terms of, and I use those terms not to, some good water users and some poor water users. And what we see is some differences, quite stark differences. We've labelled those, the disengaged through the highly engaged, but actually the highly engaged might be quite a wrong term for this group, because what you see is knowledge, identity and support for different water sources is high, but in fact their behaviour that they're doing, so putting in water saving devices, water saving behaviours and reducing pollution, is not as high. So what you might want to do with this target audience is call them out on their attitudes that they're expressing. And in fact, there's a group here we've called Engaged Not Cautious, which is the second group from the right, who actually we see are doing lots of really good water saving behaviour, but they don't care about the environment. Is that a bad thing? Maybe not. But the point I'm trying to make is unpacking the problem is a valuable exercise, and I think it can be really useful in tailoring your interventions. And while there are some interventions that work really well across large audiences, equally I think there are some good interventions that work at much smaller scale. So let's move on to number two. So once we've unpacked the problem, number two, which I think has a couple of parts to it, which is the I know what works. And there's different parts to I know what works. And I think the first one, and this is one that's going to be very familiar to this audience, I'm sure, is that information and knowledge will change behaviour. I've just got a couple of examples here. I like this one. It comes from a cycling promotion fund. And what it's trying to say is that if there's the same number of people who are walking or on a bus, they take up that much space on the road. If you're a cyclist, you take up a little bit more. And if you're in a car, you take up an awful lot more space on the road. Now this promotion, which went around a lot of Europe actually, came with this kind of little byline. Now they'll get it. Convincing the world that bike transport is highly efficient, saves the taxpayer a fortune, has never been easy. But this new photograph should help. Now, who is a rider? So who doesn't ride actually? Hands down, who doesn't ride to work? You've read this now. We're gonna monitor you because you get it now, right? I make the point. I think it's made. I think another space that's kind of a bit concerning, which is one which again ties into Jeremy's talk this morning, is one area where there's a tremendous amount of evidence that should be guiding both policy and behaviour is in climate change. We've got such a strong evidence base. And my former boss, one of the leading climate scientists in the world, in fact, said this is the story of his life. So in the 90s, he was sort of saying this might be a problem, and right through to now, when he's saying, is this microphone on? And I think it's actually one of the great sort of failures in some ways that all this information we've generated hasn't been put to good effect and to good use in terms of changing both policy, practice and behaviour. And of course, the classic one, which we've all seen this morning, is our favourite, about trying to switch the light off, another great example. All right, so the second one around I know what works is that incentives will work. And we often see people slipping into incentives as sort of the tool to change behaviour. And don't get me wrong, in fact, incentives can work. And in doing research for this, I came across a show called I Bet You Will. I don't know if anyone's heard of I Bet You Will. It's in America, where they go and they get people to do things for money. This is Tamra, and she is drinking a glass of milk. But what she's done before that is she's been paid $20 to take off her shoes and socks, put some shrimp paste down both of her socks, put her socks back on, run around the block with those shoes and socks on, and then was paid $20 for that. Then they said, we'll give you $100 if we can strain some milk through your socks into the glass and you drink it. And here she is blocking her nose, drinking the milk. Now, there might be other factors at play here. Of course, there were audiences and television cameras which influence it. But the point is, incentives worked to do pretty crazy stuff. And I'm not going to say too much about the next slide, except $70. But there are failings of incentives. They don't always work. Often they don't. And I think one of the earliest case studies was from the 50s in Switzerland, where they were trying to look for a place to store waste, nuclear waste. And this is a problem that's still around today. And what they did is offered people who live nearby a potential site to store your waste 4,000 francs to accept that facility in your area. Or compensation, 4,000 francs per annum. Now, in the 50s, I don't know what that translates to now, but a lot of money. And what the community said was, actually, no. Is it that dangerous? Is it worth 4,000 francs every year? We don't want to have that in our backyard. So they were quite opposed to it. And so the government came back, I think, a little while later and offered them 6,000 francs. No one changed their mind. Then they offered 8,000 francs and one person changed their mind. The point is, incentives can actually backfire quite badly, and this is a classic case. Another very quintessential study, which many of you will know, came from the 70s, which is around offering a financial incentive to donate blood. Anyone here a blood donor? Okay, so if I asked you the reasons why you donate blood, I bet you've got some pretty strong intrinsic reasons why you do it. It matters to you. And so paying people is what economists call it can crowd out those your values. And so by paying them, what happened in the 70s, and it has been been shown to work a few other times, although the flip side has also been shown, so the evidence is a little contested, is that we had quite a big reduction. This was the very initial study done in the 70s. A more recent study from Childcare was done by a guy called Uri, who is a behavioural economist who we hosted 2 years ago, and he did this work where introduced a fine for being late to pick up your kids from Childcare in Israel. And they introduced a fine of $3 if you're late. And in the past, he used to rush like crazy to make sure he was there to pick up his kids, because that was kind of the deal. And then when it was a $3 late fee, I'll turn up late and pay my $3. And in fact, what happened was late pickups doubled. It seems like a pretty good deal. Incidentally, when they took the fee away, the late pickups didn't change. They stayed late. So they crowded it out. They crowded out that reason for turning up on time, and then they weren't able to return. So Uri, who's someone who I admire very much, says pay enough or don't pay at all. That's his saying. And I think there's a couple of good examples of that where incentives have worked. I think the solar rebate scheme, by and large, has worked quite well. We had high incentives initially, we drove a market, and now most of the incentives for solar panels have been reduced, but it's so much cheaper to get solar panels on your house. And so it's actually quite an effective use. And another one, which is a great quote that comes out of the conversation, which is about wind turbine syndrome, is that it seems to be magically curable with the wonder drug money. And it's generally true that those incentives are quite large and it seems to work quite well. So we're still on the I know what works part, and this one is one that may not be so obvious to you and is worthwhile highlighting, which is if people only knew how important or how significant the problem is, they would change behaviour. And I'm going to start not with an example of that. I'm going to start with a case study which probably several of you know quite well, which is the flip side of this, to illustrate a point that I'll return to earlier. This is a typical energy bill that many of us get now. I imagine many of you get a bill now that tells you, and water in fact as well, that tells you how much your neighbours are using. Do we get, there's general nods around the room? And this works quite well. The very first study that was done on this was done about 10 years ago by Wes Schultz, Bob Cialdini, and they ran this study to try and work out what might work in terms of influencing people's behaviour in energy behaviour in their household. And they tested 5 different messages. I won't go into what they are. But the interesting thing they found was when they told people what their neighbours were using, in the first iteration, is that all the people that were using a lot of energy indeed came down, and all the people that weren't using much energy came up. And the lesson here, and incidentally, they put smiley faces on if you're below now, and that keeps you down, so that's good. But the lesson here is we like to be normal. People like to follow norms. It's a fundamental human trait. We don't like to be sticking out, and we tend to follow what others do. And it's been shown in lots of contexts. So let me get back to my point around understanding the size of the problem or telling people. So when I see media reports of things like this, big problems ahead as nation warned about growth and obesity, and we've all heard narratives about the proliferation of obesity and how it's getting worse and it's a real problem. That might make it worse, because we all like to be normal, and if everyone's becoming obese, it's normal. And I don't say this lightly, I actually think it's dead serious. And if you think about even more concerning issues like family violence, and this is again just a snapshot, I could have chosen one of many, every week a woman dies at the hands of her partner or ex-partner in Victoria. It's the leading contributor of preventable death, illness and disability in women aged 15 to 44. That is a worrying message, because it says it's normal. And indeed there are websites now, I think it's New South Wales or perhaps Queensland, that give me a counter on how many call-outs to domestic violence or family violence police are attending. And you can sit and watch the counter click. Now I get that it's really well-intentioned, it really is. It's trying to get a really good message across. But and also you have to give kudos to the people that have been fighting this message for some time, to making sure they've got family violence on the public agenda, which they have done, and that's a success. But at some point we need to recognise that if we normalise problems, it can influence people to gravitate towards them. Something to think about. Bob Cialdini calls it the great mistake. Number 3, relying on just one strategy. We've done some work which has shown, and in fact I'll give you a couple of examples, that where you have mixes or combinations of things, they tend to work much better than just one thing. This is a trend graph for smoking rates in Australia. It's hard to believe that when I was 1981, I was 9 years old, a third of people were smoking. And we've seen tremendous success in smoking, and increasingly stronger and stronger legislation and policies that have come in. And leading smoking researchers actually cite Australia as being one of the best countries, and everyone watches Australia. But it's the combination of things that have worked over time. They've driven a social norm, and now it's actually quite unusual to find smokers. They're less than they're only 15% of the population. Our campus has become smoke-free. A whole university campus is now smoke-free. But it's combinations of things. And of course, the road safety message is a very strong one as well, where it's been things like fines and policing and random breath testing and a whole bunch of things. This is more the regulatory sphere, but there's been social marketing and TAC campaigning that's been attached to this. The combination of things over time, persistence is valuable. And I think perhaps a more interesting case study is one around workplace safety. I don't know if Bill's talking about this today, but I hope he is in greater depth. But workplace safety is something that wasn't really on the public agenda. There are different ways we can think about issues, and I talked this morning about being in drought or not in drought and whether that guides the acceptability of different behaviour change campaigns. But if you think about workplace safety, 10 to 15 years ago, it really wasn't on the public agenda. And the government deliberately embarked on a whole suite of tools which included social marketing, the little kid waiting for their parent to get home, but it also included a whole bunch of specific behaviour change campaigns that in combination have led to this graph, which is a downward trend over 6 years to make Victorian workplaces some of the safest in the world. It's a great story, and it's one that came out of nothing, as in it was driven by government. Government was able to influence behaviour by embarking on this campaign together and making it was a collective effort. So the question I ask you is, why do we make these mistakes? I think there are actually quite a few reasons. Sometimes it's constraint of resources or the opportunity of things we can do. But I think probably the most common cause of why we make these mistakes is because the people we're trying to change don't think, don't act, aren't like us. And when I was thinking about putting up a slide of the people who are most dissimilar to me, it was a no-brainer. It's Collingwood fans. But the people we're trying to persuade are not like us. They're different to us. They think differently, certainly, and they act differently. And therefore, what works on me probably won't work on them. So we're a subject of our own bias. And if there's one thing you learn today, from my talk anyway, that we need to reflect on what biases we bring to our behaviour change tasks. And I've just got a nice exemplar of this, which I think is some work we did quite some time ago. In fact, I was only peripherally involved, and James Curtis, who's in the audience, was one of the main protagonists, which was trying to get people to stop walking off the track in Port Campbell National Park. This is a problem. People walk off the track. Two things happen. One, they trample all over the vegetation. That's one problem. The second is they fall off the cliff. That's also a problem, I can imagine. And so, you know, we've got signs in place to suggest that, you know, you shouldn't do this. Here's a sign, it's unstable, you know, it's dangerous. And there's also look after the vegetation, it's very sensitive and we need this vegetation. The research project that was done went in and observed the behaviour, talked to a bunch of people about walking off the track. And on the back of that analysis, we came up with 5 different signs that could work. 5 different things that could work. Some of these, I won't go into them in any great detail, but what we did is ask a lot of the senior managers at Parks Victoria, who have been, many of them have been in the career for quite some time, what do you reckon works best? And what do you reckon works worst? And here was their answers. The one on the left, work best. The one on the worst, which is a letter from a photographer saying, thanks for putting the track where it is, it's exactly where I can get my best photos, would work worst. In fact, and it doesn't always work this way, the exact opposite was found. The sign they thought would work best was no different to control, and the one that worked, that's right, and the one that they thought would work worst was in fact the most effective at stated behaviour anyway. The point here is these were senior managers in positions of strength who should know target audiences, key decision makers, but they didn't know. And that's the value of test and measure. We can come up with good ideas, but it's also, but we should test and measure them and make sure we find out what works, but it also highlights this point that you are often not in the best position to judge. Therefore, research, observation, interviews, literature and practice review are really useful tools in your toolkit to help design better interventions. And that's all I've got. Thanks.